130 years ago, right here on this beach in St. Augustine, Florida, something huge, bizarre, and unidentifiable washed ashore after a storm. It was this giant mass of flesh 18 feet long, 10 feet wide, 4 feet high, and weighing in at about 5 tons. It shocked the locals and aroused curiosity across the country, with top marine biologists arguing as to what the thing really was. Samples were taken, and then the strangely resilient blob was stored outside a rail yard for months before it finally disappeared. The story comes up now and again, and if you're from Florida, you've probably heard of it before. Depending on who you ask, the case has been closed for decades, yet debate over what the creature actually was continues to this day. This is the mystery of the St. Augustine Globster of 1896. The 1890s was a period of immense growth for Florida. The Gilded Age brought the wealth of many rich northerners down south in the form of luxury hotels, housing developments, and tourist attractions, all connected by Henry Flagler's new Florida East Coast Railway. During this time, St. Augustine was the winter destination for the well-to-do in the country. Henry Flagler himself opened up 3 super luxury hotels in the city during the 1880s. The Ponce de Leon, the Alcazar, and the Casa Monica, which you could still book a stay at today. 1896 was the year the first modern Olympic Games were held, when Henry Ford unveiled his first car, the quadricycle, and when Thus Spoke Zarathustra first debuted. On that November 30th, 2 boys, Herbert Coles and Dunham Corridor, had spent their morning riding bikes and getting up to whatever kids those days did. While cycling down Anastasia Beach just a couple of miles east from central St. Augustine, across the Matanzas River and by the St. Augustine Inlet, they came across the carcass. Half buried in the sand, the boys immediately thought it was a rotting whale that had washed ashore during a storm a few days prior. They soon rode back to town to spread word of their discovery. One of the people they talked to was Dr. Dewitt Webb, founder of the St. Augustine Historical Society and Institute of Natural Science. He would be the only individual with any scientific background to examine the blob in situ. Webb was a very well-respected pillar of the St. Augustine community as well. He was on the board of the local Free Library Society, was the on-call doctor of the Florida School for the Deaf and Blind, and would supervise Sunday school classes. When Webb first arrived on the scene at Anastasia Beach, he immediately came to the same conclusion that the 2 boys had, that this was the rotting remains of a whale. But he quickly changed his mind. Webb had brought a team along to document the discovery. They found that the mass had no bones and what looked to be the stumps of arms or tentacles. One man, a Mr. Wilson, who was on the scene, claimed that he had seen several of these arms and that one of them had measured almost 30 feet in length. As I mentioned earlier, the entire mass weighed about 5 tons. It was described as being mostly hollow and pear-shaped. It was elongated, broad, rounded at one end, and flattened and torn at the other. There were no visible eyes, nostrils, blowholes, or any other kind of distinguishing feature. Webb thought that he could get the inside of the beast exposed and asked some of the men to hack at the hide with their axes, which they found incredibly tough even though the thing had been rotting away for who knows how long. It was found to be in an advanced state of decomposition regardless of how tough the hide was. At the end of the day, Webb had no concrete answers and tentatively concluded that it was the remains of a giant octopus. He soon reached out to other academics across the country to help tackle the question. One of the men that Webb contacted was Mr. Addison Emery Verrill, a respected biologist and curator of the Peabody Museum at Yale. Verrill was Yale's first ever professor of zoology and published more than 350 scientific papers over the course of his life. Upon receiving the descriptions, Verrill concluded that it was likely a cephalopod, specifically some type of squid. However, before any serious work could be done, another storm hit the area on January 13, 1897, and blew the globster right back out to sea. Luckily, after a few more days, the mass washed ashore again a few miles south at a place called Crescent Beach. And this time Dr. Webb showed up determined to preserve as much as he could for further study. Webb and his team pulled the glob inland and flipped it over to see the underside. They collected a variety of samples in 15 jars and took a dozen photographs from different positions and angles. It was then, with much effort, moved to a rail terminus, likely the Florida East Coast Railway's terminus by the waterfront, to protect it from weather and drifting sands. Where the mass finally ended up afterwards is unknown. It was probably tossed at some point. What we do know is that in late February 1897, Verrill received the tissue samples and got started on his examination. When they were first discussing the globster, both men concluded that it had to be some sort of cephalopod, either an octopus or a squid, but at that point Verrill had only seen photographs and read descriptions. He even jumped the gun by assigning the thing a Latin name after himself, Octopus giganteus Verrill. When he finally received the samples and could physically examine them, however, he completely flipped on the issue. Verrill discussed his findings in an article he wrote titled "The Florida Sea Monster," published in April 1897. Webb had sent him several large chunks of the carcass for examination. The first thing he noticed was that instead of the muscle fibers that he was expecting to see, the samples were made up entirely of hard, elastic connective tissue 4 to 10 inches thick. They were so tough that Verrill had trouble slicing through them with a razor, yet they remained flexible in his hands. The samples also contained a small amount of a nasty-smelling liquid that sank quickly in water and that Verrill described as rancid whale oil. The conclusion then seemed obvious to him. While the mass could be superficially mistaken for a giant octopus, the analysis of the fibers proved to him that it was nothing more than the decomposing head of a sperm whale. However, he did note a few things that didn't add up. There was no blowhole they could find, nor any bones, and the shape of the mass was unlike any sperm whale that he had ever seen before. Verrill chalked this up to the individual whale being deformed or sick, and that was that. The story seemed to wrap up afterwards. The globster went from being this scientific anomaly reported nationwide to nothing more than a local legend. Time went on, the country went through the Depression and 2 world wars. People just forgot. The bizarre events of 1896 were downgraded to a fun story for kids, and maybe even less than that. The tale was almost lost to time, seemingly destined for oblivion, and we might have never figured out what this thing really was if not for someone accidentally stumbling upon old newspaper clippings tucked away in the filing cabinets of a research lab some 20 miles south of St. Augustine. Forrest Glenn Wood was born in 1918 in South Bend, Indiana, studied at Earlham College, and got his master's degree at Yale. A marine biologist, Forrest became the curator for the nation's first oceanarium, called Marineland, in 1951. He kept this position until 1964 when he began to work for the Navy. It was during those years at Marineland that Wood rediscovered the story of the Florida globster. The research lab at the facility had in archive over 20 years of accumulated papers, and in 1957 Dr. Wood had been searching for some of his notes on octopus behavior when he came across an old newspaper clipping, an illustrated feature detailing the discovery of a giant octopus in Florida, larger than anyone had ever seen. This sent him down a rabbit hole for the next decade and a half. Wood uncovered loads of old articles, found Webb's correspondence, read all of the different papers that Verrill had written, and reconstructed the story essentially in its entirety. If it wasn't for Dr. Wood's work, the tale of the Florida monster might really have been completely lost. His dedication to the case put him under the radar of Natural History magazine, published by the American Natural History Museum. And in March 1971, they published a massive 3-part article on the topic titled An Octopus Trilogy. In this piece, Dr. Wood, alongside his research partner, Dr. Joseph F. Gennaro, chronicles his entire investigation of the globster. It's a very engaging read, and a digital copy will be linked below in the description. After going over the same facts that we've also covered here, they revealed their trump card. Wood and Gennaro had been granted access to the original samples by the Smithsonian Institution for contemporary analysis. It was Dr. Gennaro that went to the Smithsonian's Hall of Mollusks to examine the samples. He was met with a rancid-smelling jar the size of an old milk can filled with formaldehyde alcohol and about a half-dozen chunks of white meat. He described them as being the size of a good roast and as white as soap. Even after 70+ years, the material was so tough that they used up the blades of 4 scalpels to cut out 2 finger-sized pieces. Incredibly, the Smithsonian soon after lost the specimen jar in a move, so all that's left of the globster are Gennaro's samples. Anyways, when Dr. Gennaro got back to his lab and began studying the samples, the first thing he noticed was the incredibly poor state of preservation. There was no musculature, nor evidence of suckers, nor any identifiable skin structures at all. Microscopic analysis turned up nothing either because there was simply no cellular material to work with. So Gennaro came up with a different method for identifying what animal it could have been, comparing the pattern of its fibers. He first looked at the network of a squid's fibers and noted broad bands of perpendicular fibers with thin vertical fibers running throughout. In the octopus, broad bands of vertical fibers are separated by thin perpendicular ones. And in the globster samples, well, they're a bit of a mess due to decay and the effects of formaldehyde, but Gennaro thought that they roughly match the structure found in octopuses, broad vertical fibers separated by thinner horizontal ones. The article finishes off with Dr. Wood theorizing that giant octopuses may also exist in the Bahamas, as that's part of their cultural lore, and that both authors were confident that the mystery had finally been solved. The Florida monster had been a giant, as of yet unidentified, octopus. But was it really? About a decade after the publication of the Octopus Trilogy, a man by the name of Dr. Roy Mackal threw his hat into the globster ring and tried to confirm Gennaro and Wood's findings. Mackal is an interesting character, described as a well-studied biologist who became obsessed with cryptozoology during his midlife. Mackal is largely discredited today, and most of his later work is not held in high regard by other researchers. However, in 1986 he examined the St. Augustine Globster samples to test their amino acid composition, and came to the conclusion that it was likely a huge mass of collagen. Because of this, he thought that the globster had to have been an octopus, and that Wood and Gennaro were right with their identification. This all feels like confirmation that it was probably a giant octopus, but the Natural History article had been written for a general rather than a scientific audience, and Mackal was no longer well regarded in the field. Other researchers eventually decided that their work lacked vigor and looked into the case with a more clinical eye. In 1995, Sidney K. Pierce, a biologist, led a study to examine the remains of the St. Augustine globster and another similar carcass that washed up on Bermuda in 1988. They performed electron microscopy and amino acid analysis to learn more about the two globsters. They were both nearly identical to each other and handled the same. The work indicated that both of the samples were made up almost exclusively of collagen fibers. They noted the banding that Wood and Gennaro had pointed out and compared it to the fiber network of octopus mantle. Pierce and his team concluded that neither carcass, the St. Augustine Globster nor the Bermuda blob, were from a giant octopus nor any other kind of invertebrate. He followed that up by comparing the samples to mammal tissue and comparing the fiber networks again. They used the collagen from the tail of a rat and from whale blubber, and found that the banding of the fibers was nearly identical to whale collagen. They finished the paper off by writing,
"Altogether, and with profound sadness at ruining a favorite legend, we find no basis for the existence of Octopus gigantus. We concur with Verrill's and Lucas's final words on the matter, that the St. Augustine sea monster was the remains of a whale, likely the entire skin. Nothing more or less."
Then in 2004 came what most consider to be the final nail in the coffin for the octopus theory. That year, Pierce returned, collaborating with scientists from as far as Chile and New Zealand, to analyze the genetic makeup of a bunch of globsters, including our buddy from St. Augustine. They also performed more molecular analysis, microscopy, and hydrolysis to study the samples. They were all nearly identical at the microscopic level, however, there is some room for doubt. When they attempted to extract DNA from the samples, all except for 2 of them were too degraded, and the St. Augustine Globster samples weren't one of them. So even though this paper is often cited as the definitive proof for the globster being a whale, it's really more or less a rehashing of what we already found out in 1995. Our globster was confirmed to be a whale only indirectly. The new samples looked nearly identical to the old St. Augustine samples, and the new samples were genetically tested and turned out to be from a whale. So the natural conclusion would be that the St. Augustine Globster was also a whale. And that would seem to wrap the story up. After 100 years, St. Augustine's Globster was pretty definitively found to have been the remains of a whale, likely a deformed sperm whale. I generally agree with that conclusion, although there are others who still hold on to the octopus theory. Scott Marlowe, for example, author of The Cryptid Creatures of Florida, argued that there might be a possibility that over time the samples were switched up or mislabeled, but there's no evidence for this. While I didn't think that this was likely, reading that did inspire me to try to find the globster samples for myself, just out of curiosity. The ones the Smithsonian had in storage were lost decades ago, and the only remaining bits of the globster were kept by Joseph F. Gennaro, who we covered earlier. I thought about trying to get into contact with Gennaro, but he was born in 1925, and I can't seem to figure out if he's still around or not. But it turned out that that wouldn't be necessary at all. When I went down to St. Augustine to get some footage for this video, I decided to make a stop at the St. Augustine Historical Society, the same one that Dewitt Webb founded way back when. It's a very nice museum covering the entire history of the city, and I would definitely recommend a visit if you're nearby. Anyways, I was going through the exhibits when, in one of the rooms towards the back of the museum, I saw something that caught my attention. This display case that kind of looks like a rolling desk but made out of glass. And when I got close, I couldn't believe my luck. There it was, the remains or what remains of the St. Augustine Globster stuffed into a glass jar on display. After reading so much about this stupid thing, I got so excited at seeing it in person. It's really the best way to finish this video off. If I'm not mistaken, it'll be on display for a few more months before being put back into storage. So if you want to go check it out, now is the time. And that's it for this video. Thank you all for watching, especially to the end. That means a lot to us. If you enjoyed the video, please leave a comment, give it a like, and if you're not subscribed, please do so, ring the bell, all of that YouTube stuff. Next up will probably be our Civil War video. We're covering a very interesting secret society that was doing some very shady stuff during the war. So, until then, stay tuned and stay mysterious.